As Mexico was in a post-revolutionary world, they began rebuilding their nation under the Obregón government. As part of efforts to begin reforms, in 1938, the reformist president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, nationalized the country's oil industry. This upset powerful U.S. oil companies. This caused problems for the U.S. oil companies because Cárdenas expropriated the nation's oil production from foreign countries like the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the United States. Up until this point, only international companies were drilling for oil in Mexico. Cárdenas realized that doing so would boost the Mexican economy greatly and put a stop to strikes that were occurring. Mexican laborers were being paid very little compared to what the foreign companies who were controlling the oil drillings made. Strikes were getting out of hand, so nationalizing the oil helped calm down and boost Mexican economy. As people realized that their country wasn't benefiting from their own resources, large tensions between the U.S. and Mexico began to rise because now the U.S.'s main oil source was difficult to reach. An international boycott against Mexican oil was implemented, but Pemex, a newly founded Mexican oil company, was able to survive the boycotts, but during the 1930s, tensions grew higher.
As World War II continued spurring in Europe, trade was disrupted around the world. The U.S. slowly stepped in and replaced Europe in some areas where Latin America relied heavily on European markets. But the U.S. wanted to stay up as much as possible, as FDR had signed the Bill of Neutrality in 1937. Although on December 7, 1941, the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, so 4 days later they decided to declare war on Japan. Because this was one of the first times war was brought into the Western Hemisphere, Mexico cut its ties with Japan 2 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and with Germany and Italy by December 11th. In May of 1942, German U-boats sank 2 Mexican oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico. Germany refused to apologize or to compensate Mexico, so on June 1st, 1942, President Manuel Avila Camacho declared war on the Axis powers, which was Germany, Japan, and Italy. For the Mexican people, participating in this war was almost like a continuation of their independence movements from years prior, as they were ruled under a totalitarian-like government, and now this threatened them from Europe. The fact that they were fighting against the same type of thing that they recently fought against motivated them more to fight hard, so they can just be done with this once and for all. Although initially, Mexico wanted to keep their involvement limited to just economic and material assistance due to the compulsory military service law, the president decided he eventually wanted increased military participation, so they had a greater role in wartime strategy. This resulted in the Aztec Eagles being formed, which was a group of Air Force militia. They trained in the U.S. in July of 1944. Tensions between the U.S. and Mexico that were caused by the nationalization of oil came to a slight halt due to the fact that both of them didn't want the spread of communism entering into their countries, and were motivating them to fight the Axis of power together. The Aztec Eagles provided much support to the U.S. airmen and completed missions like conducting bombings over Luzon and Formosa. They initially were sent to the Philippines in March of 1945. The Aztec Eagles returned home as war heroes after Japan eventually surrendered on September 2, 1945. During the time of World War II, Mexicans were also allowed to be drafted into the U.S. military because of their combined motivation to win this war. The U.S. military needed as many soldiers as they could get. Mexicans were also brought into the U.S. to work in low-paying agricultural jobs, as many of these jobs were left empty from Americans going to fight in war. This helped the U.S. greatly in keeping up with their industrial power. Mexican civilians who moved here to help were able to stay and become citizens even after the war was over. Overall, from 1942 to 1945, Mexico and the U.S. were able to put aside their differences in order to fight the Axis of power, which posed a threat to both countries.
Throughout this time, the U.S. used Mexico to keep up with their industrial needs and natural resources to send to their soldiers to power them through the war. Along with the fact that the U.S. was providing other European countries, like the Great Britain, with manufactured supplies they were unable to provide themselves with as the war was being fought in Europe. The U.S. counted on Mexico and their land for natural resources, and Mexico willingly allowed them to use them because it would boost their own economy and because they wanted to win the war. Even post-war, the industries that the U.S. developed remained and actually ended up being a fundamental part of Mexico's economic growth in the future.